How's that? A friend of mine that's out in the audience today, when he received the notice that I was going to be the speaker, promptly emailed Alyssa, Kyle's assistant, back to see if Starbucks would be our caterer today. And she was a little bewildered and answered back, why Starbucks? Is that Steve's favorite? And he just said, no, I'm just concerned for the audience, you know. So it reminded me of a story, though. Early in my career, I was a young geologist at Exxon in Corpus Christi. And Exxon's a very hierarchical company. And so we'd have these reviews where our vice presidents would come from Houston down to Corpus. They'd, get up in the dark and catch the red eye. And many of these guys, were getting pretty along in their careers. And our exploration vice president was, near retirement. He came down for one of these reviews. And as he sat at the table, having gotten up very early, this story was conveyed to me, that he sat there with his little styrofoam cup of coffee, and as the meeting went on, his head began to nod, and then he'd catch himself and snap back up. But as the prospects began to be shown, he got lower and lower, and so pretty soon no one's really looking at the deal. They're just watching this guy, and nobody's going to say anything to him because he's the vice president of exploration in this big company, until finally he bam, hit that coffee, and it went everywhere, all over the table. And so with my friend Scott's admonition about Starbucks, I would just say, if you start feeling drowsy, just kind of lean back in your chair. Don't lean forward. So I wanted to talk about some things that probably you've heard among the speakers that have presented here, and they're going to be maybe spoken in a different way, but they're my personal experience, so I thought I would share them with you, and maybe they'd speak to you. The first thing I wanted to talk about is priorities, and we were just talking about this at our table, that when the oil crash happened, it probably triggered for many of you a chain of decisions that would be evaluated based on your priorities. Thinking about what's most important: your family, faith, your work, your personal well-being, your health, continued intellectual growth and friendships. And it may seem that the decisions that you make in conjunction with your work are the most important. But I would conjecture that your relationships with your friends, or if you're married, with your wife and with your family, are going to be the most enduring things that you invest in. Decisions of many times are a fork in the road. And so when you make that decision, you're going to head down a path that you would not have headed down otherwise. And the story that I wanted to share with you today relates to back when I was at Pioneer and I was vice president of exploration. The merger had just happened and we'd moved to Dallas. I had 3 children at the time. My 3 boys were 10, 7, and when we moved, my youngest was 6 weeks old. He's actually sitting back at our table today. He's 18 now. His name's Jordan. I'm glad that he's here today. My job was a pretty big job. It was a lot of traveling between divisions and meeting with people and looking at deals, and I enjoyed both the financial resources it provided for our family, and I enjoyed the decisions I could make and the authority I had. It was good. And about 6 months into that job, my boss called me in. He was the executive VP of exploration, and so three guys, me and 2 other guys, reported to him, and those other guys all worked international stuff. And so he told me, I'm thinking about retiring, and I haven't talked to the management committee or to the board, but I'm thinking you might be a good candidate to take my job. And that's awesome. It played into all those financial and authority things. I thought, gosh, this is great. But as I thought about it that day, and even as I drove home from work, I kind of had a pit in my stomach. And what I started thinking about is that I would be traveling to Africa and South America and Canada, and that my oldest son, who was 10, who maybe would listen to me for the next 2 or 3 years, and then start listening just to his peers, that I had just a limited time to invest in him. And so by the time I got home on my hour commute home, I'd kind of come to a decision in my mind, and I went in to talk to Deborah, my wife, and said, I told her what happened. I think they may want to promote me. And she said, you don't seem very happy. And I said, well, I'm not. I said, I feel like I'm going to lose this time with my kids, that you'll kind of be a single parent, and it's a great honor, but I just don't know. She said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I think I have to resign. And so that decision was, it was a bigger job and higher pay, but at the end of the day, I thought, I don't think it's the best thing for my family. And so I resigned, and they were really surprised, as you might think, but they were also very gracious to me. They kept me on. They asked for my advice in my successor, and they were very kind. And eventually, when I came to Midland, we were able to buy a property from them. So it actually worked out great, and I was able to be with my family. And so, and now, as Kevin mentioned, my oldest son, who was 10 at the time, is a partner in our company. So it was a great decision. The scripture that I thought of that kind of goes with this story is Proverbs 4:26, which says, ponder the path of your feet and let all of your ways be established. And you think about that, it's ponder is really think about, consider it, look at where it's taking you. Don't just make the obvious decision to take the next bigger job and the higher pay and the more authority, but really reflect on where that's going to take you down the road, and reflect on those relationships that it's going to affect. The second thing relative to priorities is to have a plan. You wouldn't necessarily start on a road trip without planning on where you're going. You've got to kind of look down and think about where you're headed. If you don't have a plan, you're likely to be reactive, and your first reaction may not be your best decision. It's hard to make decisions under duress. When something traumatic happens, a lot of times your knee-jerk reaction isn't necessarily the best decision. And then the obvious choice may not necessarily be the best choice. I'm going to talk in a little bit about a big job change that I had. And when this occurred, I had some opportunities to go to work for, in another position in town at a company, and it would have been a safe choice. But I solicited advice from counselors, from men in this room that were friends of mine, and ultimately decided to go to work for a small company where I could have a participation. So I didn't make the obvious choice, but I did have a plan. I had something in my mind. I went and sought guidance, and I made a different decision. And that's kind of the last point, is to seek counsel. It's difficult to have a clear perspective on what's most important. And the other thing, just like in the job with Pioneer, your pride can maybe drive you to want to take the big job or to get the big position. And that clouds your ability to think clearly. Having a wife that'll speak truth to you, or good friends that'll tell you what they really think is invaluable. So counsel will sometimes come without asking, but I've found more frequently that you have to really go seek it out. You have to choose wise friends that have made good decisions, that that when you reflect on what their life shows you, it's honorable, it's men of integrity, and then those are the folks that you need to go talk to. And there's a proverb in Proverbs 20. It says, "Counsel in the heart of a man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out." Well, that deep water, that means it's in there, but it may not just be on the surface. You have to go seek it out. You really have to try to ask it, and that's a principle that I think is a good principle to live by. So when I think about this first deal of priorities, again, think about what's most important, have a plan, and to seek wise counsel. And those are all things that will serve you well. The second thing that's really kind of been laid on my heart is as you watch men, fathers and husbands and business leaders and geologists and engineers and landmen and guys that are running businesses in the field. You're faced with lots of decisions, and sometimes those decisions can be between doing what's right and doing what's easy. And so in studying God's Word, He kind of laid on my heart this idea of taking a stand. And by that I mean it's to take a position in opposition to something, or to oppose or resist something. And so basically what it is when there's a right answer, but it may not be the easy answer. It may put you at odds with your company. It may put you at odds with your family or with friends, but it's the right choice. So I'll give you an example, and it's a story that you all know. It's in Exodus 14, and it's when the children of Israel were liberated from Egypt. Moses went in, and you remember all the plagues, and he took them out, and they're all going out of Egypt. They have all the gold that the Egyptians gave them, and but pretty soon they find themselves up against the Red Sea on one side, with the whole army of Egypt bearing down on them from the other side. And it's not a great position. And that's what this can feel like to you if you're in a position where you have to take a stand. So in this passage, it says, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not fear, stand by,'" which is to station oneself or to take a stand. So take a stand and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you've seen today, you'll never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. So let me point out 3 principles in this. One is the do not fear. So obviously, if there wasn't a fearful situation, He wouldn't have said do not fear. So many times the situation you're involved in where you have to take a stand, it'll be a fearful situation. It'll put you at odds with things that, may be an easy decision. And so the situation will challenge you, and there'll be reason for fear, but you have to trust in a greater power than your own. And the second thing is the stand by. Stand by. So again, think about to oppose something or to resist something. So the Lord's telling them, initiate resistance. Take the first step. Don't just go with the flow. Stop yourself. And then the third thing is the Lord will fight for you. So do not fear, stand by, and then the Lord will fight for you. So if you take those steps, in the end, once you take a stand, the Lord's going to do the fighting, which that's a great place to be, because then all you're doing is what's right, and then He does the follow through. So to go along with delineating priorities, sometimes you'll find yourself in the uncomfortable position of doing what's easy and non-confrontational, or doing what's right. Taking a stand at work may put you at odds with business partners or colleagues. It may cost you worry and aggravation, or it could cost you money. Taking a stand in relationships means not abdicating your parenting role to your wife. It means speaking into difficult situations with your children. It means to take your role as a committee or board member seriously and not just as another item to list on your resume. Taking a stand may also mean you may have to apologize for a misunderstanding or misjudgment. And so my example to you, my personal example, is that in a deal that I was involved with recently that we put together at Weatherl Energy, we sold an acreage position and we kept a non-operated interest. And I realized after meeting to discuss the deal after we'd sold it that the operator, had some issues with the way that the deal was structured. And at first I was a little bit, resistant to even thinking about, that. But as I pondered it, I began to see that I could see his perspective, that I could see where he might think this wasn't exactly a fair deal. And so I called them up and I said, I don't think I've really technically done anything wrong, but I can understand why you might not think this is exactly right. And so I'll amend the terms and kind of structure this deal a different way, because it's more important to me to preserve our relationship and to do what's right than to make the extra money. And so they were very happy that I made the call, and then they said, no, you know what, that's fine, but this call means the world to us, and we're really glad that you made the call. And then recently the operator brought me in as a partner on another deal that they came up with. So in the end, the Lord kind of preserved that, because I was willing to kind of, and I would tell you, my pride got in the way. I didn't really like the idea of making that call, but in the end it was the right thing to do. So that second idea, of taking a stand, don't be afraid. Initiate resistance when you know it's the right thing to do, and then know the Lord's going to fight for you. And then the last story I would say, I want to just tell you a personal story on taking a stand, is that I think what I've observed is that some of the biggest shortcomings that men face don't really start with complicity in moral failure. It's not like that big deal where somebody stumbles, although those are certainly the things you read about and you hear about. But I think more than that, most men deal with complacency. It's knowing the right thing to do and not doing it. And I'll give you an example. My wife and I raised 3 boys. My oldest is 28 and my youngest boy is 18, but we have a little daughter. She's 15. And it's hard for me to raise a little daughter. I'll just tell you, boys are like Labrador retrievers. You just kind of tell them something, they're resilient, they don't get too offended. Girls cry, like what? So I've thought a lot about it, but one of the things I've observed is I don't like the clothes that little girls dress in. I think they're too revealing. I think they're too old for their age. And so I'm a dad that looks at every clothing item that gets purchased for my daughter to wear, and some of them go back. I don't like them. I'm not going to let her wear that. And the idea is, if her dad honors her and teaches her that she's to be respected and honored, then she'll expect that in relationships from other men when she gets older. And so it's easy, believe me, it's really easy to just let my wife deal with my little daughter. They're emotionally the same. But that's not the right thing to do. You have to be involved as a dad in raising your little girl. And so as difficult as that is, that's one of the places where I've been prompted to step in as a parent. And the verse that I thought of for this deal is James 4:17, and it says, "Remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it." So the last item that I wanted to talk about is probably one of the most difficult for me, and it's what's your foundation? If you think about foundation, and think about a house. It's the structure, it's the groundwork or the prepared bed that a structure is built on. And I was thinking about this because we lived in Corpus. I mentioned that earlier. And Corpus has real clay-rich soil. And so what happened in Corpus is in the summer when it was really, Corpus, you'd think it's on the coast, it rains a lot. It's not. It's arid. It's really the same climate as Midland. And we get 15 inches of rain a year. Well, in the summer when it was 100 degrees and all that clay soil dried out, it would shrink and pull away from your foundation. We used to joke that we'd get big cracks in our yard. We'd have to fence them off so our kids wouldn't fall in them. We'd lose a kid. But you could stick a water hose down in those and it would just run. It'd never fill up. It's just, that's the way it is. Well, what happens is, as that clay pulled away from your foundation would crack. A lot of times when you bought a house in Corpus, you'd have to have the foundation inspected to make sure it didn't need to be repaired. And so when a foundation cracks and you go in the house, there's cracks in the wall, there's cracks in the ceiling, there's bricks that are falling off the outside. Well, that's what happens to you if you build your foundation on the wrong thing. And so one of the discussions that we had at our table is that men have a tendency to think about goals in terms of their job, not in terms of their personal life or their relationships, but in terms of their job. It's easy for us. You're a geologist or an engineer or a landman, you're a field superintendent, it might even be in something else that you do in your leisure activity. You're an athlete, you're a golfer, you're a marathon runner, you're a cyclist, or even your identity as a father or a husband. Let's focus on that first one, on work, because that's what most of us do. It can be very satisfying, and why? Well, because as men, we like quick feedback. We get monetary rewards for success. We get promotions and more responsibility and authority. It's easy for men to process defined goals. They're not as nebulous as relationship goals. Work in itself isn't bad. Work is a good thing. God gave Adam work to do in the garden. That's part of our DNA. That's part of how we're built. But it's a poor foundation to be your identity. If your job is your identity, that's a bad thing. You're building your foundation on clay-rich soil. And when the sun comes out and the heat gets intense, you're going to crack. So let me give you my story. I was the vice president and general manager at a large independent oil company here in town. We had about 200 employees and contractors, and we ran up to 10 rigs in our drilling program. We had a great staff. In the 3-year period that I managed the division, we invested about $525 million. So we had a lot of over $500 million invested. Made good rates of return every year we invested. However, we took risk. That's part of my DNA, is I'm a little bit of a risk taker. And so I had put together a big acreage position in a shale play, just as the Barnett was really taking off in Fort Worth. And after our third or fourth well, it looked like probably most of that position was going to be uneconomic. And so about 2 weeks before my 50th birthday, I was fired from my job. And what's interesting about that is I'd never received even an unsatisfactory performance review. But that's kind of what happened. So, think about that you're in the big office with the conference table in it and on the top floor, and you go to work, and about an hour later you're driving home thinking, what am I going to tell my wife? So my world was rocked, for sure. But my job, although it was important to me, was not my foundation. One thing that kind of went through my mind as I was driving home is how can I spin this? What kind of story can I put together to make this not seem as bad as it is? And the Lord convicted me, you got to just tell the truth. Just say what it is. And, rumors, so what? If I say I'm fired, what can anybody say? The rumors will go, and I'll say, yeah, I was fired. And they're boom, it's over. The discussion ends. So I got home, And we had a son in college. My oldest son was at the most expensive college in the U.S. And that's the truth. My second son was a senior in high school, about to start college. 2 little kids at home. So I got home and talked to my wife, Deborah, and we decided we're not going to put any spin on this deal. We're just going to say what happened. And then I'm going to rely on the Lord. Well, that all may sound like hunky-dory and like a happy story, but let me just kind of tell you how that played out. It was a real difficult time, obviously. I'd be misleading you to tell you that I wasn't hurt and embarrassed and that I wasn't challenged. It was very tough. But I wasn't totally defeated. The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 10 kind of says it better than I can. He says, we have this treasure, and that's having, God in us. That's having the Spirit indwell us as believers in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing power will be of God and not of ourselves. We're afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not despairing. We're persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our body. So because of my faith in God, I believe that He was ultimately in control of this situation. I would not have lost my job if He would not have allowed it. So wrestle through that for yourself. If you just think about that. But honestly, if you're going to be honest with yourself, if you're going to have integrity in your faith, you have to believe that really the Lord allowed that to happen. So because He allowed it, I had to be confident in His love for me and His ultimate provision, and I had to choose to move forward and trust in the Lord. And so a lot of my friends, people that loved and cared about me, would disparage my former employer because of what happened to me. But because I felt like the Lord allowed it, I decided I'm not going to disparage my former employer. I'm not going to say anything bad. And, that was a challenge because I was mad and I was hurt. But I didn't. My wife didn't. It's a good company. There are good people there. Many of them are my friends, so God's in control of this. It couldn't have happened apart from His will. And also, because my foundation was the Lord and not my work or my job implicitly, I could still function as a geologist, which is what I was trained as. I had the skills and experience to do that job, and it didn't diminish my capabilities. It was just that job was where I practiced my training. And so I could do it again. It wasn't my identity. And so I would tell, just a pause in my story just to tell you guys, you may be looking at something similar, or may have already happened to you. But your job's not your identity. It's not who you are. And if you don't have to make that your foundation. If it's been your foundation, you can change that. But it doesn't have to define you. So I'm going to tell you the rest of the story with a little caveat that it doesn't always happen this way. But this is just my story, and I want to follow it through. So after about 2 months, I went to work for a small independent company. And I was totally humbled. And I'll tell you, humility is a little bit liberating, because it's really kind of pride that keeps us a little bit puffed up and wanting to kind of preserve our image. And when you're totally humbled, you're just kind of like, okay, whatever, I'll do it, So I was at this little company, and I worked initially in a small windowless office. They actually offered me this other office, but they were going to displace somebody, and I said, no, I'll just work in. And where's that person going to go? They said, in this room. Well, it was a storage room. And I said, no, I'll work in there. They go, really? And I go, yeah. I was humbled. I'd been managing exploration and business units for years, so I had to relearn how to be a prospector. I had to relearn how to put deals together. I had to teach myself to pull data. I had to dust off my prospecting skills and learn how to use computer mapping, which back when I was a geologist, we didn't do that. We drew maps with pencils. So I had to learn it all. So I worked on my first idea. I kind of had this idea, and I worked on it for about 4 months and realized it wasn't going to work. It was going to fall flat. So that was my first 4 months. And then a friend came in and showed me a little deal on which he'd put together 120 acres, and it was in the Southern Midland Basin. It was an Ellenberger deal, and although I thought the Ellenberger looked interesting, what I was more intrigued with is the Wolfcamp. It just looked like every well, when it drilled through the Wolfcamp, had these shows, and I thought, let me look around. So I found this field nearby that had made 15 BCF out of the Wolfcamp. There's no sprayberry down in this part of the world, but at that time, the wolfberry was being exploited on the eastern edge of the platform. And I thought, hey, maybe I could put together a play that's just a Wolfcamp play, but we could, try to do vertical wells and do multi-stage completions, and maybe coming from where I'd worked, it could even be a horizontal deal. I don't know. Well, so I started working, and I correlated tens of miles across this county, and I worked on this deal and showed it to our managers and our owners, and we showed it to our partners, and everybody liked the idea, and so we started putting acreage together, and we put together about 45,000 acres. And so that was all exciting. And I personally invested in this deal. Like, I'd put money in the land, like I'd gotten some severance, and I put my money in this deal. So we drilled 4 little vertical wells and fracked the snot out of them, like just really put a ton of sand in them. And we made 4 uneconomic little vertical crummy gas wells. So now we've got 45,000 acres, 4 uneconomic wells, and partners that are kind of panicking, And I'm like, gosh. So I got fired, and then I did this 4 months that didn't work, and then I put this deal together. And so I had run mud logs, though, and FMIs on all these wells, and I pulled everything out, just studied it. And what I couldn't, what caught my eye was just this upper 500 feet of Wolfcamp was just fractured. It was so fractured, so it was brittle. There were these carbonate zones in there that I thought the gas was coming from, and I started thinking, I don't think it's coming from I think it's coming from the shale. I think it's all these brittle, fractured intervals. So I approached the partners and said, I think this deal might be a good horizontal deal. But our company wasn't equipped to drill horizontals, and so we developed a plan. We'll show this deal to some companies and see if we can get somebody to buy this deal, and we'll keep a proportionally reduced quarter, and we'll try to see if this deal, can be a horizontal deal. So a good friend of mine who'd come to work with me as a landman, Scott Jones, he's here today, and he and I worked, and we showed this deal. I thought of 6 companies. The first 2 declined to look at it. The next 4 looked at it, and 3 of them declined it. But the 4th one seemed intrigued by the idea. And Scott and I were able to negotiate an agreement with them to turn them this big acreage position and get a number of wells drilled to test the play concept. And you know who that company was that bought the deal? It was the company that fired me. They bought the deal. So on the 4th horizontal Wolfcamp well, the Wolfcamp IP'd at 800 BOE per day, and now there's been a couple of hundred wells drilled in that position. And so I trusted the Lord, and He preserved my relationship with my former employer. He protected me even though in my prideful kind of hurtness, I wanted to be kind of lash out, but I didn't. So He protected me in that. And then he worked out a result that I couldn't imagine. I mean, I couldn't. If you told me this was going to happen, it's still kind of hard for me to believe. So that's a great story, but I'll tell you, it doesn't always turn out that way. I mean, your deal doesn't always work, and it doesn't always happen that way. And I'll tell you that not every situation will result in a positive income. It could be just as likely that the Lord could have had me change careers or move out of town or 100 other outcomes. I don't believe in prosperity gospel. It just doesn't happen. And I'll tell you a flip side story that is also personal. It's my oldest son who's still living out his trial. He was born with a vascular malformation on his lower left leg. And when he was 4, we started having surgeries in Boston. We'd have to drive or fly up there. And when he got older, we had to buy a motorhome so we could drive him up there for these surgeries. And he's had 11 surgeries now. And the last one was this past June. And he's been hospitalized multiple times for infections and blood clots. He deals with constant pain every day. And it's not fixed. And it may not ever be fixed. He's 28 now. So he's spent 24 years like dealing with the surgeries, although he's had it since birth. And if I could take that from him and take it on myself, I would have done that, but I can't. And it's just the way it is. But I would tell you this, it's just like the storm that I had with my job. Everybody's going to deal with storms. You're going to deal with storms, and you could probably stand up here and tell about your storms just like I've told about mine. You're going to have relationship storms and employment storms. You're going to have storms in every part of your life. And you can try to weather those storms in your own power, or you can appropriate the power of the God that created the universe and let Him help you through those storms. You're going to have them either way. So Luke 6:47, Jesus explains how this works. Everyone who comes to Jesus and hears His words and acts on them, Jesus will show you whom He's like. He's like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on a rock, and when the flood occurred, the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who heard and has not acted accordingly is like a man who built his house on the ground without any foundation at all, and the torrent burst against it, and immediately the ruin of that house was great. So Jesus doesn't say if the storms come, but He says when we have storms. So in my conclusion here, and I've thought about all the men that have been up here to speak, and if you guys have attended these luncheons this fall, you've heard all these really great talks. But it struck me that this might not even make any sense to you. Because all that I'm telling you is predicated on having a relationship with Jesus as the Lord of your life. So if you heard Bob Bledsoe last month talking about going through cancer treatment, and he said it was a sweet time. I would tell you, if you don't have that relationship with Jesus, you could not call cancer treatment a sweet time. If you heard Will Van Lowe, the managing partner of Quantum Energy Partners, telling you that Jesus had been His Savior, but He had to make Him His Lord, that might not make any sense to you either. Or Barry Davis, the CEO of InLink, this huge multi-billion-dollar company, who said, one of the best pieces of advice he got was to spend another 10 hours a week with Jesus. With all his new responsibilities, then that may not make any sense to you. And so maybe it's because you need to enter into a relationship with Jesus. Romans 10, 9 through 13 says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made to salvation. For the Scripture says, whoever believes on Him will not be put to shame. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So if you believe that Romans 10 verse that I just read, and you want to have that power to weather the inevitable storms of your life, and to have peace through hardship, please talk to your table leaders or come find me after the talk, and I'd be happy to visit with you about that. But I want to thank you for being so attentive. I didn't see anybody fall asleep and bust their coffee cup, so that's really nice. And I hope that you guys all have a wonderful Christmas. Thanks for having me today.